The timestamp on the filing was 11:47 a.m. The timestamp on the security footage from the executive floor of Harland & Voss Capital was 11:47 a.m. Investigators would note this later. The specific, unrepeatable coincidence of the two clocks. The way the moment Marcus Harland stood in the glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor and screamed those 4 words at the only black woman in the room was the same moment, to the minute, that her attorney pressed submit on the 847-page complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Labor, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission simultaneously. Marcus Harland did not know this when he said it. He did not know his general counsel was at that moment on the phone in the building's lobby being served with the first of 3 legal notices. He did not know the woman standing across the mahogany table from him had spent 14 months building a case that was, at the moment of his loudest confidence, already in the hands of people whose job was to take it seriously. He knew one thing, that Renata Simmons was in his conference room, and he intended to remove her from it. What he did not know was that removing her from the conference room was the last decision he would make as the unchallenged chief executive of a $9 billion firm. 5 years before 11:47 a.m., Renata Simmons walked into Harland & Voss Capital on her first day as a senior portfolio analyst and understood 2 things before she reached her desk. The first was that the firm was exactly as talented as its reputation suggested. The second was that the talent was organized around a set of unspoken rules that had nothing to do with ability and everything to do with proximity to Marcus Harland. And that proximity to Marcus Harland was governed by a logic she was going to need time to fully map. She was 36 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Memphis and an electrician who had spent his career working jobs that required precision and had taught his daughter. At a kitchen table not unlike the one her mother used for grading papers, that precision was the only form of power that could not be taken from you once you had genuinely acquired it. She had acquired it early. She had a finance degree from Spelman College, an MBA from Wharton, and 8 years of prior experience at 2 asset management firms where she had built a track record in fixed income derivatives that was, by any objective measurement, exceptional. The offers she received when she decided to move came from 4 firms. She chose Harland & Voss because it had the best performance data, and because she was 36 years old and done choosing the second best option for reasons she had learned to name. Harland & Voss was a private investment management firm founded by Marcus Harland 22 years ago from a base of family capital and an instinct for distressed asset acquisition that had made him, by the time Renata joined the firm, one of the more closely watched figures in the mid-market private equity space. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the specific certainty of a man who had been right enough times in a row that being right had stopped feeling contingent and had begun feeling constitutional. He moved through the firm the way founders move through firms they have built from nothing, as though the space itself were an extension of his judgment, as though the people in it were variables in a model whose parameters he had set. He was not stupid. Renata never made the mistake of thinking he was stupid. Stupid men did not build $9 billion firms, but there was a category of information that Marcus Harland had spent 22 years declining to incorporate into his model. And that information was the kind produced by people who did not look like the people he had always been surrounded by. And the exclusion of that information had become, over 22 years, so habitual that he had ceased to experience it as a choice. She learned his model in her first 6 months. She learned it the way she had learned every professional environment she had ever entered, by watching the system rather than the individuals, by tracing the patterns of which ideas got credited and which got absorbed and which got redirected towards someone else's proposal 3 weeks later and presented as novel. The patterns at Harland & Voss were not subtle once you understood what you were looking at. Ideas generated by the firm's senior analysts, most of them white, most of them men. Most of them from the 2 or 3 EMBA programs Marcus Harland had decided 2 decades ago. Produced the kind of thinking he trusted. Moved through the system with the ease of things that belong where they are. Ideas that originated elsewhere moved through a longer path that involved more checkpoints and more people and a higher evidentiary standard and a greater likelihood of arriving at the destination with a different name on them. She watched this happen to 3 of her recommendations in the first year. She documented the first one because she documented everything, which was a habit she had developed in her previous firms, and that she had not stopped practicing simply because Harland & Voss was more prestigious. She documented the second one with more detail. By the third, the documentation was thorough enough that her attorney, when she eventually showed it to her, called it a gift. She had not contacted the attorney yet. She was still in the phase of watching and measuring and determining with precision the difference between the kind of environment that was uncomfortable and the kind that was actionable. She had made this determination before and been wrong in both directions, and she was old enough and experienced enough to know that being wrong in either direction had costs. She was gathering the information she needed to be right. Marcus Harland did not pay sustained attention to Renata Simmons in her first year. She was a hire he had approved on the recommendation of his head of talent, a man named Philip Greer, who had flagged her track record and credentials in the way he flagged anyone whose numbers were strong enough to require acknowledgement. Harland had approved the hire and noted the credentials and moved on, because the firm had 47 analysts and his attention was not a resource distributed equally, and the distribution logic was his own. He knew she existed. He did not know in the first year what she was doing. In the second year, he started to notice. Not because he was looking for her, because she was producing work that was being noticed by the people whose work he paid attention to. Her fixed income analysis on a distressed debt acquisition in the 3rd quarter of her second year had identified a structural covenant issue that the firm's deal team had missed, and that, if the acquisition had proceeded without the correction, would have resulted in a loss the firm's general counsel later estimated at somewhere between $60 and $90 million. She had flagged it in a memo. The memo had gone to Philip Greer, who had taken it to the deal team, who had taken it to Harland. The covenant issue was real. The acquisition was restructured. The deal closed clean. Harland asked Greer who had written the memo. Greer told him. Harland said nothing further, and the conversation moved on. But Renata noticed, because she noticed everything, that the quality of the space she was given to work in shifted slightly after that quarter. Not dramatically, nothing that could be named in a meeting. The kind of shift that an environment makes when someone with authority has updated, partially and reluctantly, an assessment they had not been consciously aware of making. She had experienced this shift in previous environments and knew what it meant and what it didn't mean, which was that it was a change in the ceiling of what was possible, not the removal of the ceiling. She kept working. She kept documenting. The pattern she was documenting was not only the redirection of ideas, though that continued, and she continued to record it. It was something she had begun to see in the firm's broader data, the portfolio performance data, the compensation records to the extent they were accessible, the promotion history over the prior decade. She had access to some of this data through her role. She compiled the rest from sources that were technically public, but practically obscure, the kind of sources you had to know to look for. What she was assembling over the course of the 3rd and 4th years was a picture that the firm's external presentation did not show. The performance data for the firm's fixed income book, the book she primarily contributed to, showed returns that consistently exceeded the firm's own projections, and that, when examined in detail, were disproportionately attributable to a cluster of analytical work that she could trace to her desk. The compensation data, cross-referenced with the publicly available partnership track records, showed a pattern in which analysts with equivalent or lesser performance outcomes who happened to match the firm's historically established demographic profile advanced at rates that she did not. The picture was not ambiguous. It was the kind of picture that, once assembled with sufficient precision, was no longer a picture, but a record. She called the attorney in the 31st month. Her name was Diane Park, and she had spent 18 years in employment and securities law with a specific concentration in financial industry whistleblower cases. And when Renata presented what she had to Diane in a 4-hour meeting in Diane's conference room on a Saturday morning, Diane had said, about 45 minutes in, that she needed Renata to slow down so she could take notes. That had not happened to her in a while. They worked together for 14 months. The 14 months were not passive. They were months of the specific, painstaking work of converting a picture into a legal complaint, which required a different standard of evidence than recognition, and a different kind of organization than understanding. Every document was verified. Every data point was sourced. Every claim was tested against the threshold required by the relevant regulatory body before it was included, and what did not meet the threshold was set aside rather than approximated. Because approximation was how cases failed, and they were not building a case to fail. What they were building, by the time it was complete, was an 847-page complaint that addressed 3 distinct legal frameworks simultaneously. The employment discrimination component, filed with the EOC, documented the pattern of compensation and advancement disparity with the specificity of someone who had kept records from the first month. The labor law component documented wage theft in the form of systematically uncompensated work product, the redirected recommendations, the absorbed analyses, the ideas that had traveled from her desk to someone else's portfolio under a different name. And the securities component, the one filed with the SEC, the one that Diane had told her, the first time she'd understood its full dimensions, was the piece that would make everything else move faster. Documented something Renata had identified in the firm's trading patterns in her 4th year, something that had nothing to do with her own treatment, and everything to do with what she had access to see from where she sat. The trading pattern was not subtle once you knew what you were looking at. Harland & Voss made 8 trades in 18 months that preceded material non-public events affecting the securities traded by margins that were, in isolation, explainable as coincidence, and that, in aggregate, were not. Renata had not been privy to the source of the information. She did not need to be. She was privy to the trades, and to the pattern, and to the specific organizational behavior that preceded each trade, the closed-door meetings, the document access restrictions, the particular atmosphere of controlled information that a trading floor develops when certain people know something and are managing who else knows it. She had documented the pattern with the same thoroughness she had brought to everything else. Diane had looked at it for a long time before she said anything. Then she said that the SEC's whistleblower program offered financial awards of 10 to 30% of sanctions collected in cases where the information provided led to enforcement action exceeding $1 million. She said she was not telling Renata this as a motivation. She was telling her because Renata deserved to know the full picture of what she had built. The filing was scheduled for 11:47 a.m. on a Thursday. The timing was not accidental. Diane had chosen the time to align with the simultaneous service of legal notices to the firm's registered agent and general counsel. Because the simultaneous arrival of multiple legal actions at multiple regulatory bodies from multiple directions was a specific strategy. The strategy of someone who understood that the first 48 hours after a filing determined how an institution responded, and that institutions responded differently when the filing came from one direction than when it came from every direction at once. Renata had known the time for 2 weeks. She had not planned to be in the building at that moment. She had been summoned. Marcus Harland called her into the conference room at 11:30. The call came through his assistant, which was the method he used when he wanted a meeting to feel like a summons rather than a request. A distinction he applied deliberately, and that everyone who worked for him understood. She went because not going was not a viable option in the world that still existed at 11:30, and because she had learned, over 5 years, that the meetings Marcus Harland called when he felt his territory was being examined were informative in ways he did not intend them to be. He was standing when she arrived. He was standing, and the door was closed, and there were 2 other people in the room. Philip Greer and the firm's head of compliance, a man named David Foss, which told her the meeting's character before anyone spoke. Philip Greer would not meet her eyes. David Foss was looking at the table. Harland had found something. She did not know what. Specifically, she suspected it was the data request she had made 3 weeks prior, through a process that was technically within her access rights, and that had nonetheless drawn the attention of someone in the compliance department who had flagged it upward. The data request was legitimate. It was also, she was aware, the kind of request that a person building a legal case would make. And Marcus Harland was the kind of man who pattern-matched quickly when his interests were involved, even if his pattern matching was imprecise everywhere else. He told her what he believed she had been doing. His version was incomplete and partially wrong in its specifics, and entirely correct in its general direction. He told her it was a betrayal. He told her the firm had given her everything she had professionally, and that what she was doing was a demonstration of exactly the kind of character deficit that explained why certain people never rose as far as their apparent qualifications suggested they should. He told her, and this was the part that told her everything she needed to know about the distance between his understanding of the situation and the situation itself, that she had no idea who she was dealing with. He was building to something. She could see it the way you see weather coming. He was a man who had operated from a position of unchallenged institutional authority for 22 years, and who had, in those 22 years, learned that the sufficient expression of that authority was enough to resolve most situations that threatened it, because most people who threatened it were not in a position to sustain the threat. He had not updated this model to account for what was sitting across the mahogany table from him. He said it at 11:47. The words were 4. The volume was the volume of a man who had forgotten that volume was not authority, or who had always confused them and never been corrected. Philip Greer flinched. David Foss looked at the window. The glass walls of the conference room meant that the 8 people working in the open space of the 32nd floor could see everything, though they could hear only the register and not the words, which was in some ways sufficient. Renata did not flinch. She was looking at Marcus Harland with the expression she had worn in every meeting in the past 5 years, the expression that was not blankness and not anger, but the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person who has already done the work and is now simply watching the situation arrive at the destination she prepared for it. Her hands were flat on the table. She was thinking, among other things, about the timestamp, about Diane, in her office 12 blocks away, pressing submit at this exact moment, about the 847 pages, about the covenant memo in the 2nd year, and the documentation from the 1st month, and the trading pattern she had assembled from a seat that no one had thought to consider a vantage point. She thought about her father at the kitchen table in Memphis, checking his work one more time before he set the tool down. Because once you touched the wire, the precision was the only thing between you and what happened next. She waited for Harland to finish the sentence. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely level, "I'd like you to note the time." He didn't understand. She hadn't expected him to. It was not for him. The regulatory response moved faster than the financial press expected, and considerably faster than Harland and Voss's legal team had prepared for, which was itself a function of the simultaneous multi-directional filing strategy that Diane had designed with exactly this dynamic in mind. Regulatory bodies, like all institutions, respond to urgency in proportion to how much urgency they perceive, and what they perceived in the first 48 hours after the filing was not a single complaint, but a convergent picture from multiple authoritative sources that told the same story in 3 distinct legal vocabularies. The Sex Whistleblower Division opened its investigation within 6 days. The trading pattern Renata had documented gave them a map rather than a starting point. And investigators who begin with a map move differently than investigators who begin with a question. The 8 trades were identified, traced, and connected to a pattern of information access within the firm that implicated 3 senior partners in addition to Harland himself. The insider trading component of the case, when it concluded, resulted in disgorgement orders and penalties that the financial press reported as among the larger enforcement actions in the sector in the prior 5 years. The EOC complaint and the labor claim moved through their respective processes on the parallel tracks that Diane had designed them to move through. The compensation disparity documentation, cross-referenced against the firm's own performance records, produced an evidentiary picture that was, in the words of the EOC investigator who handled the initial review, unusually complete. Unusually complete was regulatory language for the documentation being good enough that the investigation was substantially about confirming what was already demonstrated, rather than discovering what was unknown. Marcus Harland resigned from the firm in the 4th month, before the SEC investigation concluded, in a statement that described a desire to focus on personal matters, and that did not mention Renata Simmons or the 847-page complaint or the timestamp or the word he had said in the glass-walled conference room at 11:47 on a Thursday morning while 8 people on the other side of. The glass watched the register of his voice and understood the character of what was happening without hearing the content. His resignation did not resolve the legal proceedings. The proceedings did not require his presence at the firm to continue. They were built to be independent of him, the way the complaint had been built to be independent of his response to it, because Diane Park had spent 18 years understanding that cases built around the subject's anticipated reaction were cases the subject could disrupt, and cases built around the evidence were cases the subject could not. Philip Greer cooperated with the investigations. He had, it emerged, been uncomfortable with several of the trading decisions for longer than he had allowed himself to articulate, and the articulation, when it finally came in the context of a formal regulatory process, was useful enough to the investigators that his cooperation was formally acknowledged. David Foss, the compliance officer who had been looking at the table when Harland said the 4 words, had left the building at 12:15 on the day of the filing. He had gone to his own attorney. His attorney had called Diane Park's office at 2 p.m. They had had a productive conversation. Renata's settlement, when it concluded, was confidential in its specific terms, in the way that settlements are confidential and consequential in its general dimensions, in the way that consequential things are. The SEC Whistleblower Award, which was public in its category if not its specific amount, was reported in the financial press as substantial. Diane Park, in the one interview she gave on the case, said that her client had done something that most people in her position did not do, which was to treat the documentation as the work and the outcome as the consequence, rather than the reverse. She said that most of the cases she lost were lost because the client had prepared for the outcome rather than the record. She said she did not lose this one. Renata took 3 months. She did not take them as rest, exactly. She was not built for rest, in the conventional sense, had never been built for it, and had come to accept this about herself as a structural fact rather than a deficiency. She took them as the specific reorientation that a person needs when the project that has organized their energy for 14 months concludes and the energy is still there. Looking for the next form, she read, she thought. She talked to her father, who had a habit of asking the question she was actually trying to answer before she had finished formulating the question she thought she was trying to answer, which had always been his most useful quality. She founded a consulting practice in the 4th month. It was a small firm, precisely by intention, built to work with institutional investors on the specific intersection of performance analysis and governance risk that her years at Harland & Voss had given her an unusually detailed map of. The first 3 clients came through connections who had followed the case and understood what the case demonstrated about the quality of her judgment. The 4th came through a referral from Diane Park, who had continued to encounter people who needed someone who could see what was in the data and knew how to make the records say what the data showed. She kept the documentation. All of it, everything from the first month to the filing, in the organized format she had maintained from the beginning, not because she expected to need it again in the same form, because her father had taught her that the record of the work was as much the work as the work itself, that the discipline of keeping it was the same discipline as the discipline of doing it, and that a person who kept the record and kept it correctly had already answered the most important question before anyone asked it. She had kept it correctly. The timestamp proved that. 11:47 in the morning on a Thursday, in 2 places at once. A conference room on the 32nd floor where a man had said what he believed, and a filing system at 3 regulatory agencies where the record said what was true. Between those 2 things there had never, in the end, been any contest. There was only the question of when the second one caught up to the first. It had caught up at 11:47. And the second, unlike the first, was permanent.